Right, this week's demo lab is on elaborated crosstabs. So you want to open up the document and the syntax. Okay, and it says the first step is to open up the dataset and codebook for General Social Survey 2022. Okay, so now I have those. So let's see what's happening next. So our dependent variable is, so we're going to start with a bivariate crosstab and chi-square. So the same thing as the last demo lab, and then we're going to elaborate on it and make partial crosstabs. So this time we're going to use theism 3cat v1. Last time we used v2, version 2. Let's look at what this is. So for v1, it's 3 categories, and this was, look at this card and tell me which statement comes closest to expressing what you believe about God. And so for this, if they said, I don't believe in God, right, like a no, then they're a 1. If they said, I know God really exists and I have no doubts about it, right, then they're a yes and they're a 3. And anything else from I'm not sure to sometimes with doubts. So like sometimes, somewhat, maybe, I don't know, any of that is a 2. So we have definitely not, I don't know, maybe, somewhat, and yes. So there's 3 categories. So the believers, the non-believers, and the somewhere in between. And then we're going to use gender M for independent variable. And that is just female or male. And that's just a dichotomous indicator variable. Okay. So we're going to turn on weighting and run frequency tables for both variables. So right now we're just looking at them and seeing what the distribution is. So why don't I first try this with syntax. So I'm going to make sure that my syntax commands will show up in the log. I'm going to turn on weighting, and I remember from past weeks that the name of the weight variable for this data set is weight variable. And I'm going to run a frequency table for theism cat version, which one was I wanting to use? Version 1. And I'm going to run a frequency table for gender M. Okay. Now I'll show you also the drop down. I could go edit, options, and viewer. Make sure this is checked and click OK. Data, weight cases, find my weight variable, put it into the weight cases box, and click OK. Analyze descriptive statistics, frequencies. Make sure this is checked. I don't need anything here. I'm just doing the frequency table. And I wanted gender and let me sort these. Theism 3cat P1 and click OK. Okay, so I'm going to put my syntax into here. And then I'm going to put my output. So my 2 frequency tables. So what we see here is that, right, among our respondents, again, weighted to better reflect our target population of U.S. eligible of U.S. adults, that about 7% said they definitely don't believe in God. Almost half said that, yes, they definitely believe in God. And then just over 2/5 are somewhere between these 2 categories. And then we can see that just over half are female and just under half are male. Okay, so now we're going to create a crosstab. So here I'm saying, right, do theism beliefs differ by gender, right? Is there a relationship between gender and theism beliefs? My null hypothesis would be no relationship. My alternative would be that there is. My dependent variable here, the outcome variable, right, is the theism 3cat v1. And then my independent variable is my gender one. So I just put those in and click play. Alternatively, I can go analyze descriptive statistics crosstabs. I want to make sure that my independent variable goes into the columns and my dependent variable goes into the rows. And then I need to turn on chi-square under statistics. And under cells, I need to turn on column percentages. And then I click OK. All right, so let's put in my syntax from that. And let's put in my output. Okay. Tell the story of your output using real life context. What is the relationship between them? Explain it in reference to crosstab column percentages. Then we do significance, substantiveness, and causality. So let's start with looking at the relationship. So what I see is that among women, over half are say yes, they believe in God, whereas for men, it's closer to 2/5. And so women are more likely than men to definitely believe in God. And men are like, well, that's like 4.2% more likely, but almost double as likely to say they don't believe in God. And then we can see the differences here. So men are a little bit more likely to say maybe or somewhat because they're less likely to be here. So that's distributed between these. So I'm just gonna crop this so I can look at it at the same time as I'm trying to write and explain this. So I'm only really looking at this part right now. Okay, so looking at my sample, what do I see? I see women are more theistic than men overall. So women are, so again, I'm comparing crosstab column percentages going across. So this is going to be over 10% more likely to believe in God. Men are 4.2%, almost double as likely to not believe in God. Okay, so the relationship here is significant. We see that from p is less than 0.001. So we're going to explain what that means, and we're going to again do 1 minus p to explain that. So if p is less than 0.001, then that's like 0.1%. And so 100% minus 0.1% equals 99.9%. Or I could do 1 minus 0.001 equals 0.999. And so I am over 99.9% confident that among my target population, so you at the adults in 2022, there is a relationship between gender and theism. Right. So what this is saying is that there's a less than 0.1% chance that probability, so that if we were to randomly sample US adults, we would have gotten this kind of differences if there was actually no relationship, if these were the same. So if they were the same, we'd expect both of these to be 49.7 and both of these to be 43.5%, right? The subgroups would reflect the total percentages. And so we're saying it's very unlikely that we would have pulled a sample like this if we were random sampling. We're using a probability-based sampling method that reflects our target population if in fact men and women had the same percentages for these different things. So now we need to say whether or not it's substantive. And again, we have our crosstab column percentages right here. So I'm going to say it definitely is, right? Like we have over 1 out of 10 more women saying yes than men. And And this one is not 5%, but considering that there's not that as many people in these categories, I'd say these look pretty different to me, right? So um, yes, it is substantive, right? Are um, over 1 in 10 more women than men are believe in God, and men are almost double as likely as women to not believe in God. The difference between these two, between men and women's theistic beliefs, is sizable, meaningful, substantive. I'll just say substantive. Okay. Do I think it's causal? So if it's causal, it has to meet all five criteria. Let's see. So it is significant, it is substantive. The causal order, um, gender might influence your theistic beliefs, but if you believe or don't believe in God, that's not going to change your gender. Does it make theoretical sense? And is it non-spurious? So I can't really think of any variables that would precede gender in this. Yeah, even if we think about like, no, yeah, I can't think of any that would make sense for that. So theoretical sense, why might women be more likely to believe in God than men? Um, Maybe as a marginalized identity, women are more likely to seek out belief systems. I don't know. I don't want to go into stereotypes around spirituality or belief, but I think I'll just stick with that. So again, we're not researching this right now. I just provide an idea. Um, so I'm going to argue it is causal. Again, if let's say it wasn't substantive, then I would say it's not causal because it's not substantive, right? The percent as noted in C, right? It's not very different. Or if it was spurious, then I could say that, right? I don't need to evaluate all five unless it's causal. If it's causal, I need to evaluate all five. If there's at least one of these that doesn't work, then it's not causal, and I can explain that. So I do think the relationship is causal, and that gender is one factor that has an impact on variation in theistic beliefs. Um, we know that the relationship, no, we are confident that the relationship exists, that would be in B, and is substantive. Gender, um, so our theoretical explanation, women might um, turn to God as an avenue for, as a response to oppression more often than men in a patriarchal society. Um, this would mean the causal order is correct. This gender could influence beliefs, but beliefs around God do not change one's gender. And then I cannot think of a preceding variable that would explain away the relationship, meaning it's non-spurious. Okay, so I answered that I think it's causal, and then I went through all five of these. All right, part two, elaborated crosstabs. So we're going to use party 3 cat. And so it says, write an extended research question that includes the control variable. So this is basically it. We're going to fill in the names for this. So does the relationship between, remember our IV was gender, that's our independent variable. Our dependent variable, DV, is theism. So we know there's this relationship between gender and theistic beliefs. We just did that in part 1, and we're saying, does it differ by political party. Okay, and now we're gonna just look at party and see the breakdown of that. So we're using party 3-cat. So this came from this original party variable of 0 through 6, strong Democrat versus strong Republican, and this is just collapsing it so into Democrat, independent, and or other, and Republican. Okay, so we have 3 categories here. So I'm going to run a frequency table for party 3-cat. Again, I could also go analyze descriptive statistics frequencies and put party 3-cat into here. Click play for enter. So let's put my syntax in. And let's put my output in. So we can see that almost 3/10 are Democrat, just under a quarter are Republican, and just under half are independent or other. Okay, so now we're going to run our elaborated crosstab. So we're using the same theism 3-cat v1 and gender for our dependent and independent variables. And then you can see it's the same syntax except it has another by and then another variable, right? And so here's where we're adding the control variable, which was party 3-cat. And why don't I just copy my syntax to here? And I'm going to click play. Oops. Now, how would I do this? Otherwise, I could go analyze descriptive statistics, crosstabs. And I'm just going to add in that party 3-cat as a layer, right? So that's going to mean I'm controlling for it. And I'm going to click enter. It's going to do the same thing. Okay. So now I need to put this over. This is a lot to put in. So for my chi-square test, I'm going to get rid of some of this information I don't need because it's just too much to look at for me. So this is if you were calculating chi-square by hand, this is like the chi-square value you would get. This is the degrees of freedom based on the number of rows and columns and then you'd go to a chi-square table. But really all we need is the p-values, and I'll keep this so you can just see the sample sizes as well, though those are in the crosstab itself. Okay. And then here is this. This is long. So why don't I'm going to do all of the partial crosstabs. Then I'll do the total crosstab. I'll also do this chi-square test split. And you know what? I'm also just gonna, well, I could crop it over there. I'm just gonna do this part though, because if I need to see something further down and it's hard, I might want to use this later. But I don't need that now. I'll just put it right here. Okay. So here is my elaborated crosstab. Okay, so you'll notice that we have now a crosstab of gender and theism among Democrats, among independent other, and among Republicans. And then we also have this total. And you'll see that this total actually looks pretty similar to this crosstab. So you can see that these percentages are pretty close. Even the numbers are pretty close, right? There's like a few fewer people here than here, 3 fewer here. So they're slightly different, but they're almost the same in terms of the percentages. And so what the difference here is that basically this total is the same as this. However, remember we add another variable, and so there's a few people. You can see that this has 2,292 weighted respondent cases, and this has 2,253. There's a few people that we don't know their party identification. They didn't share it or weren't asked, or they gave an unintelligible response or whatever else. And so this is the same as this, but among the people that we know, we have valid data for all three variables, whereas this is only for independent and dependent variable. And if we don't know their party, we still have their data here. But this one is only if we also know their party. So these look pretty similar, other than that one thing. Okay, let's go back to where we were. So we're going to interpret each partial crosstab using real-life context. We're going to do the same thing we kind of did above when we were talking about crosstabs. So the interpretation is the same. It's just that instead of among our whole target population or the respondents for our whole target population, we're looking at the partial crosstabs among the subgroups. And so we're going to see if there's a relationship, and if so, what it is, if it's significant, and if it's substantive. Okay, so let's start with the first partial crosstab, which is among Democrats. So there's always a lot to look at. These partial crosstabs, elaborate crosstabs, they get big. So this is what I need to look at for the crosstab, and then we'll look at the chi-square part later. So A, given it, tell the story, is there a relationship? So we can see that among Democrats, right, women respondents are more likely than men respondents to believe in God. But here it's only by about 4.2% instead of before. I remember it was like 10%. And men are still more likely to not believe in God, but here it's like 3.4%. And then these are almost the same. So so I'd say A, like looking at the respondents, among Democratic respondents, women are more likely than men to be theistic. About 4.2% more likely to believe in God, and 3.4% less likely to not believe in God. Okay, they're pretty similar in terms of maybe somewhat. Okay. Is there a significant relationship? So here we're going to look at this crosstab for Democrats. We can see the p-value is 0.312. So p equals 0.312. Okay, so that's not less than 0.05. So we couldn't reject our null, right? That there's no relationship, that the expected and observed crosstabs would be the same. We can't accept the alternative hypothesis there is a relationship. So we are not over 95% confident that there is a relationship among US adult Democrats between gender and theism. So again, it's the same thing in terms of our target population, but it's a subgroup, right? It's just the Democrats. So you can see, again, going back here, that among the 2,253 folks total, right, we have like 545 that are Republican, 1,088 that are independent, 620 that are Democrat. That mostly matches this, except again, these are people that we also know these two variable informations for. And so this is just taking, right, some of the total, right? So these are taking a subset. So it's like if you had a data set that was only the Democrats in the data set, only those respondents, and you ran the same crosstabs. So we're still looking at the same relationship, gender and theism, just among this subgroup. So because it's not over 95%, I'm not going to give a specific percent, but if I were to, right, this is, it would be 68.8%, yep, 69.8, 70. It would be 98, 99, yeah. And so I'm not 68.8% confident, but we're not going to say that because we're not over 95% confident. So there's right a 31.2% probability that we would end up pulling a sample with these kind of differences if the expected and observed crosstabs are actually the same. Okay, and then C, do you think there's a substantive relationship? I'm going to say no. The differences among respondents exists, though none are more than 5% different. And when we look at whether this can be generalized to our target population, the relationship is not significant. Because we are not confident that the relationship exists, we are not going to claim that it is substantive. Okay. So even if, right, if the crosstab column percentage differences were big and it still wasn't significant, we still wouldn't claim that it's substantive. However, we might be making a type 2 error, a false negative. Maybe we don't have enough people in that subgroup. And so, we're not confident because we just don't have enough people to generalize from to have that kind of confidence. So, but if it's not significant, we're saying it's definitely not substantive. If it is significant, then we're looking and saying, okay, let's look at these crosstab column percentages. How much do they vary? And in general, right, if they're varying by at least 5%, we're going to say it's substantive. Otherwise, we kind of have to use our own contextual evaluations of it. Okay, now we're going to do this again. So our next one is for independent other. Okay, so for this one, well, I'm just going to see the independent other P is less than 0.001. I'll just note that. And let's get our crosstab. And so I can look here and then go up to see which one's female or which one's male and remember it. I'm just going to use cropping because it's going to make it easier for me to look without all of this stuff. So I'm cropping to just look at just the independent other. And then remember earlier I cropped this top part and I'm going to put that right there. And so now it's just easier for me to look at it without having to kind of scroll up and down with my eyes and keep track of everything. Okay, so A was, is there a relationship? If so, what is it? Discuss the percentages, etc. So what we see here is that here, women are, it's the same thing as before. Women are more theistic than men overall. This is among independent other respondents. So you can see that women are 10% more likely to believe in God. So that's the 52.2 minus the 42.2, and 4% less likely to not believe in God. And we can see that then men are therefore, right, 4% more likely to not believe in God and 6% more likely to say maybe somewhat is where the difference is there. Is it significant? So yes, it's significant. P is less than 0.001, which is less than 0.05. So I am over 95% confident that there is a relationship among US adults whose party is independent or other between gender and theism. And then I can see that if P is less than 0.001, that's going to be 100% minus 0.1%. and I can multiply this by 100, or I can move the decimal over 1, 2. Um, which equals 99.9%. So instead of saying I'm over 95% confident, I'm going to say I'm over 99.9% confident. Now, if P were actually like equal to 0.001, I would not say I'm over 99.9% confident. I would say I am 99.9% confident. It's because it's less than that I'm saying I'm over. Okay, then C, is it substantive? So I'm going to say, yes, it's substantive. Um, I am confident the relationship exists, right? Because it's significant. And the differences are sizable. Um, so for example, 1 in 10 more women believe in God than men among respondents. Okay, and now we have Republican. So if I look here, I can see Republican. Yes, P is less than 0.001. And let's grab this again. And again, I could just keep this as is and look, okay, this is 4.6 for male compared to 0.4% for female, or I could look at these and just look at that. I'm going to, again, just crop it to make it easier for myself. Okay. So is the relationship? We see that women are more likely, men are more likely to not, with men more likely to maybe somewhat. And so it's the same thing, yes. So among Republican respondents, women are more theistic than men overall. And here we can see that women are about over 3/4 of women believe in God, whereas just over half of men believe in God. So there's a pretty substantive difference there, more than we've seen before. Um, that's going to be 23.8% maybe, but are over 20% more likely to believe in God. So that's this comparison of these two. And um, and over 4% less likely to not believe in God compared to men. So that was the difference between these. Indeed, well, almost 1/5 of, sorry, almost 1/20th of men, 1 out of every 20 men, that would be like 5%, do not believe in God. Um, about 1 out of every 200 women do not believe in God. Again, this is among Republicans. So 1% would be like 1 out of 100, and so 0.5% would be like half of that 1 out of 200. Um, and we can see that men are almost double as likely to respond that they maybe or somewhat believe in God compared to women. Okay, is it significant? P is less than 0.001. So yes, it's the same thing as last time. I'm just going to copy and paste that, but change my, instead of whose party is independent or other, just changing that to Republican. So I'm over 99.9% confident that there is a relationship among US Republican adults between gender and theism. And is it substantive? Yes. Right. It's substantive. I'm confident the relationship exists and the differences are sizable. Um, I don't want to rewrite that, so I'm just going to reference So I already shared the crosstab column percentage differences in A. Okay. So that's it for number 6. Now, number 7, did your control variable affect the relationship between your original independent and dependent variables? If so, how? Explain using real life context and justify your answer. So what happened once we introduced the control variable? So originally, again, we had, or if we look at this total here, right, we remember that we had about a 10% difference here and about a 3% difference here. And that it was significant, right? And so there was this relationship. Once we break it down, we see that first, we're not confident there is a gender difference in theism among Democrats, but there is among independents and others. And then we also saw that that relationship here was about 10% more likely and 4% less likely, but here it was 20% more likely. And then, well, it was still the 4, it was, you can see that, right, it was, this is like, let's see, 0.5 would be 5 into 50. 4 times 10 would be like 4. Yeah, so like 11. 4 times 11 is 44. Over 10 times more higher, right? It's like this is a lot more than that in terms of the likelihood. So we can see that the differences are a lot more substantive, whereas here it's only double as likely, right? So, right, overall, this is not the question we're asking, right? We can see that in general, right, Democrats, like, are about 40%, 47 among independent other, and then 66 among Republicans. So Democrats are less likely than independent other, who are less likely than Republican to believe in God. And we can see 2.6, 6.2, 10.2 that right Democrats are more likely to not believe in God and Republicans are less likely to not believe in God. So we can see this kind of transition. But what this is asking us is not about the parties, right? We could just do a crosstab between party ID and theism. It's asking about the relationship between gender and belief in God. And so what we're seeing of that relationship is that we're not confident it exists among Democrats and that it exists among independent, other, and among Republicans, but that the gender gap is most sizable among Republicans. Okay, so what am I going to write? Yes, it does. The initial relationship between gender and theism, well, we're only confident that it exists, but it only exists among Republicans and independent, others, not Democrats. So among Democrats, Democratic US adults, there is no relationship, there's no difference between gender and theism. We can also tell that the relationship is much more substantive among Republicans than other independents. So the direction is the same, right? It's not that the relationship's a different direction. It's just that among Republicans, women, so as an example, "20% more likely than men to believe in God, whereas among independent other respondents, women were, I think it was 10%, yeah, were 10% more likely than men to believe in God." So what we would call this is a moderation or moderating variable. So when we added party, it moderated the outcome, right? It made it diverge into different outcomes. So among Democrats, there was no relationship. Among independents, it looked kind of similar to the overall. And then among Republicans, there was a much bigger relationship. Okay, so we're going to do the same elaborated crosstab, but we're going to use a different control variable. So again, we're still looking at the independent variable of gender and its relationship with the dependent variable of theism in that first version categorical variable. But this time, instead of breaking it down by party, we'll break it down by class. So I'm going to write my question. Does the relationship between gender and theism differ by class? And I'm going to run a frequency table of class. I'm just going to use syntax this time. I already showed you a couple times the drop down for it. Okay, and so we can see that among our respondents, a little under 10% said lower class, a bit over 2/5 said working class, a bit over 2/5 said middle class, and then about 1/20 said upper class. So now we're going to run our elaborated crosstab. So it's theism 3cat v1 by gender m by and then class. I could write this all out, but I already have this one that already has my dv and iv, so I'm just going to change this one from party 3cat to my new control variable. Click play. Oh, here's my chi-square test. I'm going to just delete everything other than the p-value one so I can make comparisons and look at them all without all of this. Okay, so here's my p-values. Here's my crosstab, partial collaborated crosstab. Let's just start with the first. And I'm just going to pull this also again just for below. Okay, so now it says interpret each partial crosstab. So now I have lower, working, middle, upper class. Were there 4 or 5? Let's see. It was lower, working, middle, and upper. Yep. Okay, so there's 4 of them. So for lower class, well, let's look. You can see, why don't I just write my okay, so I know B is about significance, so I'm just going to take my P values for a second and put them in as placeholders. For lower class, P was equals 0.005. For working class, P is less than 0.001. For middle class, P equals 0.163. And for upper class, P equals 0.039. Okay. So let's look at lower class first. So what I see here is that women are more likely than men to believe in God, and men are more likely than women to not, right? As well as somewhat. And so it's the same thing we said before. Women are more theistic than men overall, or more likely to be theistic. And we can see that that's about so women are over 20% more likely to believe in God. And so that was this minus that. And then these two, we can see men are over 6% men are over 6% more likely to not believe in God. That'd be 10.5, yeah, not quite 7%. Um, okay, then for B, we're saying that it is significant because this is less than 0.05. If you ever have trouble comparing, remember you can also always write the 0.05 out instead of like this, you can write it out like that. And if you have another number, like even like that, you can write out like that to compare. So you can always go have both of them go to the thousandths place and make that direct comparison so you don't get confused if you're struggling with that. But anyway, um, this is going to be 0.5%, right? That's 0.005 times 100, or I move the decimal 2 to the right. And so 100% minus 0.5% is 99.5%. So yes, it is significant. P equals 0.005, which is less than 0.05. And then I am 99.5% confident that among lower class US adults, there is a relationship between gender and theism. And finally, C, yes, it is substantive. I am confident the relationship exists and the differences are sizable. Okay, now let's look at working class. So here's where, I could copy this twice and I could just look at it like this, but I want to just look at it, the thing. I could copy this twice and get the top part again, but if you remember, I already just took a screenshot of the top part right here. So I'm just going to put that on top of it. They have to be the same kind of size to line up, or else I'd have to kind of realign it, but this makes it just easier for me to look. Okay, so here we can see that women are again more likely to believe in God, less likely to not. Men are more likely to maybe somewhat. So it's the same relationship. And we also know again that it's significant. So, I'm gonna copy this and then just make changes. So, okay, so overall, how much more likely are women than men? We can see for the first one, it was 20% here, 56. It's about 14%. So women are about 14% more likely. And then for not, this is 5.7%. So that's what, 6% less likely. And then here, right, it is significant because P is less than 0.05. So I'm over 99.9% confident that among working class US adults, there's that relationship. And then we're done with that one. Okay, middle class. So I'm cropping this to just look at the middle class. Let's make this down so it's just on one page. And so here we can see actually that it's not significant. Let's look at here. So we can see women are more likely. So among respondents, right, what are we seeing about the relationship? Women are more likely overall, but instead of 14%, right here, they're 6% more likely. And then for not believing God, men are still more likely to not believe in God, but it's only like a 1.1% difference. So it's much closer together among respondents. And so here we're not confident, right? This P is not less than 0.05. So we are not over 95% confident that there is a relationship among middle class US adults between gender and theism, right? So these differences are not big enough that we're confident that with sampling error and everything else that they would pan out when we look at all US adults who are middle class. And then for this, we would say, no, it's not substantive. While there were substantive differences among respondents, right? Like we knew that this was over 5% different, right? Over 1 out of 20 more women than men. But again, that's like when we we're looking before at the sample means and comparing them, but then we looked at the 95% confidence intervals and we saw how, like at 95% confidence, how different might they be. And so this saying, like, we're not 95% confident that these actually would be different. While they're different among respondents, we're not confident that among all US adults who are middle class, they would be different. So the relationship is not significant. So we are not confident it even exists, let alone is sizable. Okay. And then lastly, upper class. What I see here is still women more theistic than men, men more likely to be not theistic. So women are overall more likely to be theistic than men. We can see women are about 7.9%, so about 8% more likely to believe in God. And then we can see actually the big difference here is interesting is between those who don't believe in God. Now our sample size is a little bit smaller here. So that's likely also why our p-value might be a little bit not as small, because there might be a little more variation in if this were 1 or 5, right, then like that would influence this percentage a lot more. But anyway, we can see here that actually men are almost triple as likely as women. Like if I'm doing 4.6 times 3, or more than triple as likely, almost quadruple as likely. Yeah, so actually 4 times as likely as women to not believe in God. So we can see here that if I just subtract, I get 15% difference. So okay. And then for this, this is P equals 0.039. Okay, so if P equals 0.039, then that's less than 0.05. So it is significant. So that's 3.9%, right? 0.039, I either move the decimal over twice or I multiply it by 100. And so 100% minus 3.9% gives me 96.1%. So I am 96.1% confident that among upper class US adults in 2022, there is a relationship between gender and theism. Okay, and then yes, it is substantive. I am confident the relationship exists and that it is sizable. Okay, did your control variable affect the relationship between your original independent and dependent variables? If so, how? So again, originally we know that there was this relationship between gender and theism, right? It was P is less than 0.001. It was a little over a 10% difference here, about a 4.2% difference here. And what we can see is that that relationship holds among all groups except for middle class, where we weren't confident there was a relationship at all. And then we can also see that there was a difference where here, right, there was a very pronounced difference among the upper class in terms of not believing. So men were much more likely to not believe, and women were much more likely to, I mean, much less likely to not believe. There was a bigger gap among the upper class compared to any of the others. What about the other ones? Let's see. We had 20% and 6%, 14 and 6, 6 and 1, but this one wasn't, and then 8 and 15. So we can see that among the lower class, there was the biggest gap in believing. And we can see it among the upper class, there was the biggest gap in not believing. Yep, so I get it right. Yes, it did. So if we ended up where you control and basically each of the partial crosstabs looks the same as this total in terms of the gaps, right? Then, and they're all still significant or they're all still not significant or whatever else, right? Then we might say, right, it didn't have an effect. But we can see that it is, again, moderating in this case what's going on. So the relationship between gender and theism. So first, we are not confident that the relationship between gender and theism exists among middle class US adults. We are confident it exists among lower working and upper class adults. And then among upper class adults, there is a much bigger gap, gender gap in not believing in God, right? So again, here, men are 15% more likely to not believe, whereas for lower and working, it was like 6%. So that's over double double the gap. And then here is 20 and 14 versus 8. Among lower and working class adults or US adults, right? There is a bigger gender gap in terms of believing in God. So again, it's still the same gaps as before. The directions didn't change. We could say that. I don't, unless you said something different, I would assume that, but the direction was still the same in everyone, right? That women more and more theistic and men more non-theistic among all subgroups. You might have it sometimes where that actually changes direction, and that's something you would then note. Okay. I'm gonna go to this here. So this is just a few examples that can help you with as you're trying to understand your elaborate crosstab or with the quiz as well. And so here's from a AINS, just like we're using an AINS data set for independent labs. This is an AINS data set for 2012 that the author of another social statistics textbook kind of put together to make ready to use. And so this one is a relationship between sexuality or sexual orientation and dog ownership. And so we see in the total that gay or lesbian folks, about over 2/3 have a dog versus just under half of heterosexual folks. And we can see in our chi-square that P equals 0.042, which is less than 0.05. So there is a significant relationship. So there's a relationship, we're confident it exists, and it's that gay or lesbian folks are more likely to have dogs than heterosexual folks. Now we can break it down by gender, and we can see that the relationship, we're not confident it exists among men, but we are among women. So let's look what's going on here. So for men, we can see that actually gay and lesbian folks are less, so gay men are less likely than straight men to have a dog. But you can see the sample size is really small. And so we're not confident that this actually generalizes to all US adults in terms of differences between gay men and straight men. But here we can actually see, right, that among respondents, straight men are more likely than gay men, about 13% or so more likely to have a dog. So about 1 in 10, over 1 in 10 more straight men and gay men would have a dog. But then we can see among women, we can see it's over double. So just under half of heterosexual women have a dog, but then over 9/10 of lesbians have a dog. And so we can see that we saw this relationship between sexuality and dog ownership, but then once we add the control variable, we can see that that relationship only exists among women and not among men, or that we're confident it only exists there, and that it's a very sizable gap, right? And so here we don't think it's as big a gap, but that's because it's a very sizable gap among women, but then it's actually reversed among male respondents. Okay, this one is from GSS 2021. And so we're looking at class again, and then this time assistance for childcare. So this is one of those questions that says we're spending we are faced with many problems in this country, none of which can be solved easily or inexpensively. I'm going to name some, and for each, tell me whether you think we're spending too much, too little, or about the right amount. And so for this one, it was assistance for childcare. And so you can see for the totals that first P is less than 0.05. And so we're saying there is a relationship between class and how much whether people think we're spending too little, about right, or too much on childcare assistance. And then we can see if we think about like who thinks we're spending too little, let's see, class goes lower to upper. So 59, 59, 54, it's pretty consistent actually in terms of like about 55 to 60% say we're spending too little. And then who thinks we're spending too much, you can see as class increases, this is increasing. So the difference between lower and upper class is 6.2%, and it's over double, right? It almost doubles from here to here. And so we can see that that's increasing with the difference kind of made up in terms of about right. So as class increases, people are more likely to say we're spending too much on childcare, assistance for childcare. So now we're going to add a control variable of gender. So let's see what happens here. So we can see that these p-values are both less than 0.05. So we're saying there is a relationship between class and how people feel about assistance for childcare, both among men as well as among women, US adults. Among men, we can see that 51, 58, 50, 58, 6, 9, 11, 8. So here, these are, again, between 50 and 60-ish. It goes up a little, down a little, up a little. But there's not a clear direction there. But what we see here is that it's going up like before, but then it goes back down a little bit. Well, let's look at women. So for women, we can see, I mean, it's a little higher than here, but it's 66, 60, 60, 60. So we can see lower class women are a little bit more likely than the rest of women to believe that we're spending too little on assistance for childcare. So while there's not that difference here among men, it's lower class men aren't particularly, they don't have a higher percentage. In fact, we have lower and middle class are kind of at the lower end of this, around 50, and then these are a little higher. And so while lower class men are not particularly saying we're spending too little assistance on childcare, lower class women are more likely than other women to say we're spending too little. And then we look at too much, we can see, okay, it's going up a little, it stays, and then goes up more, which was the original pattern for the total, that it's increasing, although there's not a gap here. But what we see is that this goes up and then kind of doubles. This one went up a little bit, and went back down. So for women, we can see that upper class women are more likely than upper class men actually to say we're spending too much on childcare, right? That as class goes up among women, they're going to say we're spending too much. Whereas among men, it starts to do that, but then it actually doesn't continue that pattern. Upper class men are less likely than middle class men to say we're spending too much, although the difference isn't that great, especially compared with our sample size here. What I think is most interesting here is that these are actually not that different. The lower class and upper class here, they're quite different. So we see that among women, right, lower class women that are not going to say we're spending too much on childcare, but over 1 in 10 upper class women will. And so you'll see this increase as women's class goes up. They're much more likely to say we're spending too much, but the lower class women are not saying that. Over 1 in 5 lower class men are, but it doesn't really go up that much. There's not too much of variation among men by class in terms of who's saying we're spending too much, whereas among women, there's definitely a big change from the lower class to the upper class. Then here is a Pew data set also put together by Thomas Linneman. So we have a racial independent variable. We have in the last 30 days, how often have you found that you could not cope with all the things you had to do? Frequently, sometimes, hardly ever, or never. And we can see that overall, right, it's significant. And that, let's see, white is this category. So whites were about 7% more likely to say never compared to respondents of color. They're basically about the same in terms of frequently, about 5% different in terms of hardly ever. And then we can see that people of color were about 10% more likely to say sometimes. So we can see again, frequently is not very different, but then whites, I mean, if you combine these, we're about 10% less likely to, more likely to say hardly ever or never. And then respondents of color were about 10% more likely to say that sometimes they could not cope. So then when we break this down by gender as our control variable, we see that actually this is only among men and not among women. We're not confident the relationship even exists among women. So you can see here when we look at sometimes, there's still like a 8% gap in this sample. Here there's like a 5%, here there's a 2, here there's a 2, but we're not confident enough from this that that this would hold up when we look at all women US adults, that there would actually still be a substantive difference or a difference at all. And so we're saying we're not confident the relationship exists here. But among men, we can see that here it's still 2.5. Here it's almost like a 13% difference. And then here it's like a 12% difference. So whites are about 12% more likely to say they never found that they couldn't cope in the last month with all the things they had to do. Whereas for respondents of color, they were about 12% more likely to say that sometimes they found they could not cope in the last month. So we're seeing differences, substantive differences here among sometimes and never among men. And among women, we're not confident that there are differences. Okay, this is the last one that I'm going to show you a comparison of. So we're looking at whether folks live in a rural, suburban, or urban community and whether or not they have heart disease. So these are all going to be low on the bottom, hopefully, because we hope that most respondents have not had heart disease. But we can see that, right, there is a significant relationship between the type of community that you live in and whether or not, and the preponderance of heart disease. And we can see that among all respondents, they're not that different, but suburban communities at the highest at 8.2, a little bit less than 1% lower is rural, and then a little bit less than 1% lower is urban. And so there's like a 2% gap between suburban and urban. Again, like these aren't that big of differences, but also if you think about heart disease, right, this is the small percentage changes are pretty consequential. So this might be meaningful. Then when we look at gender, we can see that there is still a significant relationship among men, and there's still a significant relationship among women between type of community and having heart disease. But if we look at, let's just look at the yes. So if we look at men, we can see it's going up. So from rural, it goes up 2.8 to suburban, and then up another like 0.5 to urban. So rural men are the least likely compared to suburban and urban men, which are about 3% higher likelihood. But then if we look at women, it's actually the opposite. So rural is the highest, and then it goes down by about a point to suburban, and then it drops almost in half for urban. And so among women, rural and suburban women are the most likely to have a heart attack, to have heart disease versus urban women. So when we moderate, we actually see that the relationship between type of community and having heart disease is the opposite and is different for men and for women, which we don't see when we just look at this. Right here, they look pretty similar, but here, for example, again, we can see that actually urban women are about half as likely to have heart disease compared to rural and suburban women. But for men, rural men are the least likely to have heart disease, and a few percentage more likely are suburban and urban men. Okay, you can stop watching the demo lab now. I'm going to do two more examples if anyone wants them. I know elaborated crosstabs can be difficult or confusing, and so I'll do a couple more examples, two more, but if you don't want to follow along or watch these, you can still have full credit for the demo lab. So these I'm going to use the same data set that we're using for our independent labs, the AINS 2021. And I'm just going to go ahead and close out. You can see when I have these two open at the same time, how in brackets it says this is data set 1 and this is data set 2. And so when I'm running syntax, this is telling me which data set's active and so which thing it's going to run it on. So this has to match for it to try and run it to the right variable. And so if you're not seeing the variable come up or whatever else, sometimes that's because you have too many data sets open. I like to just have one data set open at a time. I'm going to get rid of this GSS one and just have the AINS one open. Okay. So what we're doing for this, our dependent variable is going to be party ideology knowledge. Let me show you what that means. So that says, would you say that one of the parties is more conservative than the other at the national level? And if they say no, then that's the end. But if they say yes, then they're asked which party is more conservative. So I have this as a 3 category. So -1 is yes, Democrats are more conservative, which is wrong. The next one is 0, no, one party is not more conservative, also wrong, but interesting, right? And then 1 is yes, Republicans, which would be the accurate answer. So we're going to look at the relationship between that and as our outcome variable, and then how interested would you say you are in politics? So my idea is that people who are more interested probably will be more accurate in terms of knowing which party is more conservative or not. And then we're going to add a control of party ID. And so we'll say, okay, we might have this relationship. Does it differ by what party you're in? So like if you're Republican, what's that relationship look like versus if you're Democrat or independent among the subgroups? And then we'll do this again with party ideology knowledge, but this time I'll see if different ages are more or less aware of which party is more conservative or what they think. And then we'll see what happens when we add education as a control variable. Okay. So I'm putting in my dependent variable, my independent variable, and my control variable. And then let's do it again. I'll just run them both, and then we'll talk through these. Oh, I want to turn weighting on also. Okay. So let's look at this one first. And so we can see overall, right, all of these are significant. So first for our total, this is not at all, not very, somewhat very interested. We can see that this is the correct. So like Republicans are more conservative. We can see that as people are more interested, it goes from those who are not all interested are about half likely to choose Republican, and it increases until the folks who are very interested, 88.4% of them are correctly identify Republicans as being more conservative. We can see that, right, these are both going down as well, right? As interest goes up, those are going down. So that's what we expect. Let's see how this works among Republicans. So among Republicans, we can see that overall, so this is this cross subgroup. overall, right, 7% think Democrats are more conservative, about 5.4% think no party's more conservative than the other, and then almost 90% correctly say Republicans are. We can see it the same thing, it's increasing as people are more interested. There's like a 25-ish% gap here, and then this decreases and this decreases as well. Among independents, same thing, we can see this is increasing. So we can see here again that like these folks are a little less accurate comparatively, but we can see this one increases. It basically doubles, right? Because here they're starting as more accurate and going up. This one goes up like 40%. This is decreasing and this is decreasing. So maybe these folks have more of a stake in the Republican Party, whereas these folks are care less about primary parties. I mean, the two main parties, which is why they're independent or other party. And so, if they're very interested, they're likely to know, although still less likely than this group, but there's a bigger gap. Because I guess these folks at least had to choose Republican in order to be identified as Republican. And let's look at Democrats. Again, huge increase from like 50 to 86, so not quite doubling, but going up like 37%, 38%. And then this goes down, and this goes down, but this is interesting that so among those not interested who are Democrats, 15.4% of Democrats think the Democratic Party is more conservative than the Republican Party. We can see that among those not interested, it's about a fifth of folks. And then it stays kind of the same for those who are not very interested. It's still about a fifth. And then it drops a little bit, like 7%, 5% to 7% among those who are somewhat interested. And then we get a drop of 10% among those very interested. So I think that's interesting how this one kind of stays, drops a little bit. It mostly drops between very interested and the rest. Whereas for here, we can see there's a big drop here and then a big drop here, and these are similar. And for here, we can see that right, there's like a 10% increase here, another kind of 10%, another 7%. So it's kind of continuously going up a little bit each time. So when we're looking at just people's own parties and how they think. So the relationship exists. It exists among all of the subgroups as well. But again, we can see that there's a bigger substantive gap among the non-Republican parties in terms of identifying Republicans as it. And we can also see that, right, for example, among Democrats, this is kind of where the gap is here. If we look at neither party is more conservative, this is a big change. So among independents, going from 43 to 11%, this one only goes from 15 to 1, and this one goes from 29 to 7. So it might be also, again, that just independents or other party are generally not as tuned into the two different parties, and which is more conservative or not as more conservative. And as they get more interested, right, then they become more tuned in. But Democrats and Republicans, even if they're not interested, have more awareness. Okay, then this one, we're looking at age and the same question. So we can see that overall there is a relationship. P is less than 0.05, 98.7% confident there's a relationship. And we can see that, so what is this? This is youngest, middle, oldest. Okay, so from the youngest group to the middle group, it goes up about 3. So it's about 3/4 of folks who say, I correctly identify Republicans, but it goes up about 3%, and then it goes up another about 5%. There's about an 8% gap between the youngest and oldest. So the older folks are a little bit more likely to correctly identify Republicans as more conservative. We can see in terms of identifying Democrats as more conservative, it's pretty consistent, a little over 1/10. It drops down about 3% between the younger and middle and the oldest group. But it's there. And then here we can see it's going down a couple percent and then a few more percent. So that's kind of the overall relationship is mainly that, right, there is one. As you get older, you're a little bit more likely to identify Republicans as being the conservative party, a little less likely for the others, but it's not that substantive. The most substantive is kind of this difference here of the younger versus the older group for Republican. I guess there's a 5% difference from here to here as well. Um, Now let's look at the by class. So if we look at this, we can see we're only confident that there's a relationship between age and whether which party you think is or is not more conservative among those with less than a high school degree, some post-high school and no bachelor's degree, and that's it. So among those who with a high school credential, bachelor's degree, or graduate degree, we're saying actually there's not a relationship. We're not confident that there is a relationship. So age doesn't have it, wouldn't have an impact on, wouldn't have a relationship with um, your likelihood of identifying one party versus another as being more conservative. Let's look at how that pans out. So it said it does exist among less than high school. So we can see here, in fact, the youngest group, about a quarter, say Republicans are most conservative. It jumps up to over half and then over 2/3 when we get to middle and older groups. So there's a big difference here. This is over a 40% change from the youngest to the oldest group. You can see this is like cuts in half and over in half again for the no party selection. And then this is actually pretty consistent in terms of people choosing Democrats. So among those with less than a high school degree, we can see that as age increases, there's a pretty substantive shift from thinking that neither party is more conservative to saying Republicans are more conservative. And we could think that might be, just as people are around longer, they are exposed to more about the parties, they hear more about them, they know that Republicans are more conservative than Democrats. Then high school, which we said there wasn't a relationship with, we can see this is pretty consistent. So it goes up by about 5%, but right, these are pretty close. They're all in the 65 to 70-ish range. You can see here it's about a 2%, about 3 more percent. Here it's not ordered in one direction or another. And so here we're not seeing that gap that we saw of this kind of substantive increase. Instead, what we're seeing is that, remember that the oldest group with less than high school ended at 67.4% saying Republicans. And here we're saying it starts at 64.2% already identifying Republicans as more conservative. So this is saying, okay, maybe, if you're going to school, maybe in high school you learn about the political parties. If you finish high school, that's something that's part of that education. Maybe there's something spurious going on around class and political socialization or something else. But we're saying that among high school folks, right, you don't see this gap. And one of the reasons seems to be that people are already starting out more accurate than getting there. We can see similarly, right, that like the youngest group, well, these didn't really shift. Okay. Let's look at then, let's look at the last two that were not significant as well. So undergrad degree, we can see that like there's not more than a couple percent gap among any of these. Here, there's like a 4% gap. But if you have a grad degree, the idea is that regardless of your age, right, over 9/10 the folks are correctly identifying Republicans as more conservative, and barely anyone's identifying Democrats as more conservative. And so that's why we're not seeing a relationship. At bachelor's degree, again, we're starting with almost 90% saying Republicans are more conservative. And then these are falling a little bit, but again, there's not that much of a difference because people are starting out more accurate. And then this group, it said, was also significant. So let's look at some post-high school and no bachelor's degree. So here we can see it's going up by like 5% and then by another 10%. Here it's going down by about 3 and then about like 7%, a little less than that. Here going down by 2 and then about 4 more. So you're seeing about among folks who think that Democrats are more conservative, we're seeing like a 10% drop from the youngest to the oldest group. And here we're seeing 68, 78, like a 15% increase. So that's interesting that the high school credential. Okay, so what we're seeing here is again, like less than high school, big gap. High school, not a big gap. Some post-high school and no bachelor's degree, it starts out at 68.1%, which is about where the high school credential folks were. And then it increases. So that additional education of some post-high school is providing some type of educational knowledge or experience with others or some other factor that is making it so that as people get older, they are increasing their knowledge. I don't know if maybe folks who do this are tuning in more to politics. I'm not sure why, but um, it's again that they're still starting out around um, like the high, close to the highest level for the group below it, but they're increasing in knowledge as they get older more, and decreasing in having incorrect knowledge. Um, But you can see right again, they end up at 83.6, whereas for the bachelor's and graduates, they're starting at higher than that. So overall, what's the story here is that there's this small relationship overall, but this small relationship really hides kind of what's going on, right? This like 8% difference hides that really we don't see a relationship between age and knowing which party is more conservative or how you would identify which party is more conservative among folks with a lot of education or a high school degree. But we see that it's especially substantive among folks with less than high school. And then we see that each group, right, is kind of starting out at a higher base level of being correct, which is why, like, for this, like, there's not much room for growth. So if you already know which party is more conservative as a younger person, right, then like it's not changing as folks get older. There's not misinformation or something like that. But for this group, we're also seeing that even though they start out around kind of the higher level of here, right, there is still some growth towards kind of where these folks are as folks get older. Okay.